Avoidants often experience something called euphoric recall about their childhood. What this is looking back at the past through rose-tinted glasses, only looking at the positive, painting it in a different picture than it really was. A rosy light. Everything was great. Childhood was perfect. Their families were perfect. Their parents loved them, and everything was just fine. Now, it doesn't mean that the avoidant is covering up some sort of abuse. However, with severe avoidant attachment, there's almost always at least a form of childhood emotional neglect at play. This is a person that wasn't given the love that they needed from their parents or caretakers. Their emotions were not nurtured. They weren't shown how to express themselves. Their feelings were routinely dismissed, if not outright rejected. Kind of along the message of children are meant to be seen, but not heard. The message was sent loud and clear. Your emotions aren't welcome here. If you're sad, go be sad in your room. Nobody wants to see you crying. The end result is a person that feels defective. They weren't given the love in the way that they needed, so they feel unlovable, and they've learned to associate their emotions with inconveniencing others. Their emotions aren't welcome. The message was sent loud and clear. They carry this forward to an adult relationship. Now, looking back with euphoric recall is a way of avoiding. It's a way of avoiding the negative emotions from childhood. It's a method of avoiding processing all that pain, all that hurt, all of that emotional neglect. It's too painful to go there. So it's much easier to repaint history in the mind of the avoidant, to make it better than it actually was, to give it that nice, beautiful brush without having to actually face the different pains and potential traumas that they experienced as a kid, without having to process that emotional neglect. There's nothing to heal from if it doesn't exist, at least in the mind of the avoidant. So euphoric recall is a way for them to avoid processing all the things from childhood that they don't want to face. And since they're avoiding this, it becomes harder for this person to actually self-reflect, take accountability, and see where their fears come from. Why do they fear emotional intimacy in a relationship? Well, it's because they learned that you can't rely on anybody else for your emotional needs. That goes back to childhood. But if they're looking back with euphoric recall, they don't have to face that fact. They don't have to come to terms with what their childhood was actually like. It doesn't mean that their parents didn't love them, and it certainly doesn't mean that there was any kind of physical abuse. Often, their basic needs were met, especially if you're dealing with a dismissive avoidant. Fearful avoidants are much more likely to have experienced physical trauma as well. But with a dismissive avoidant, it's mostly just childhood emotional neglect. And it's very easy to put on those rose-tinted glasses and look back at their childhood with euphoric recall. They get to avoid any of the neglect, and they get to avoid self-reflection in the present because they're not willing to look in the past.